She demanded he hand over his shed, tools, and property, simply because she thought she could. Helen Grayson, the HOA president, turned rules into weapons and punished anyone who stood in her way. But Thomas Bates had something she didn't expect: evidence, a voice, and the strength to fight back. Just wait until you see how this shocking battle unfolded, and why, in the end, justice didn't just win. It roared. Thomas Bates had always been a man of quiet routines, the kind of person who paid his taxes early, kept his lawn trimmed without being asked, and avoided confrontation whenever possible. For over 2 decades, he worked long hours as an engineer in downtown Richmond, Virginia, slowly saving for something he considered sacred, a place to finally call home. At 42, that dream finally took shape. A modest, beige-colored single-story house in a small suburban community in Riverdale. The neighborhood looked like it was pulled straight from a real estate brochure. Manicured hedges, white fences, kids riding bikes, and neighbors who smiled and waved. It wasn't just peaceful, it looked safe. Thomas felt relief. He moved in during early spring. The grass was still damp from rain, and the cherry trees lining the streets had just started to bloom. His golden retriever, Buddy, ran laps around the empty backyard while he unpacked boxes and imagined this was the beginning of something new, something finally his. The first 2 weeks felt like a fresh chapter. He fixed up the gutters, repainted the front steps, planted wildflowers near the fence. Every evening he sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, listening to the wind and watching the sun disappear behind rows of rooftops. After years of city noise and concrete, the silence here felt like medicine. Then the first letter came. A white envelope tucked into his mailbox. Official letterhead, HOA, Homeowners Association. It wasn't a welcome letter. It was a fine $45 for a non-compliant mailbox finish. Thomas frowned. His mailbox was black, standard issue, no rust, no stickers. Still, he figured it was a misunderstanding. He paid it. But the second letter followed just 3 days later. This time, it was a warning. Trash bins were visible on the curb prior to 6:50 a.m. He double-checked the collection schedule. Pickup started at 7 o'clock. Apparently, being 12 minutes early was a violation. The tone of the letter wasn't aggressive. It was worse. It was smug. As a member of this community, you are expected to follow all posted standards. Thank you for your cooperation. Thomas began to worry. Was this how things worked here? By the end of his first month, he had received 5 more notices. One for wearing muddy work boots across the front lawn. Another for tools visible through the garage window. One letter suggested his lawn's edge was not adequately uniform. Another cited an inappropriate placement of his water hose. It no longer felt like enforcement of rules. It felt personal. He started noticing odd things. A car would idle slowly near his driveway in the early evening, but never park. A neighbor who once waved stopped making eye contact. His name wasn't included in the community bulletin board updates. When he asked a woman 2 houses down about HOA meetings, she looked at him, lowered her voice, and said, "I don't get involved. It's just easier that way." He tried attending the next meeting anyway. It was held in the local rec center. He stood up, politely introduced himself, and asked if someone could clarify the recent violations. The HOA president, Helen Grayson, gave him a thin smile and replied with a voice that was sweet but sharp. "Our standards are not negotiable, Mr. Bates. We maintain order for the benefit of everyone. Perhaps Riverdale isn't for everyone." The words hung in the air like a quiet threat. That night, as Thomas stood on his porch, looking at the mailbox he was fined for, listening to the eerie quiet of the neighborhood, he realized something. This wasn't a welcome. It was a warning. And it had only just begun. If there was one person in Riverdale who made people walk a little faster or speak a little softer, it was Helen Grayson, president of the Homeowners Association. People rarely said her name aloud, and when they did, it was in half jokes, half whispers. She wasn't loud. She wasn't visibly aggressive. But she didn't need to be. Her presence alone, calm, controlled, and calculating, was enough to set the tone. Helen was always put together. Perfect posture, beige blouses, her hair twisted tightly into a bun so precise it seemed sculpted. Her expressions were polite, but her eyes always seemed to be measuring, calculating, deciding. No one ever saw her raise her voice, but no one ever crossed her twice. Thomas had only met her once in passing, a short greeting near the community mailbox. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only a pause too long, like she was making a mental note. At first, he thought she was just an overly strict rule follower, the kind of person who took neighborhood order as a personal mission. But soon, he began to understand. Helen wasn't defending the rules. She was using them. 3 weeks after the incident at the HOA meeting, Thomas received a letter. Unlike the others, this one wasn't printed or formatted. It wasn't official. It was handwritten, in neat pointed cursive on thick paper, folded carefully and hand-delivered, not mailed. No header, no stamps, just his name on the front. Inside were only 2 lines. You will transfer all exterior assets, tools, shed, and storage space to HOA authority by week's end. Otherwise, we will proceed accordingly. No explanation, no legal terms, no pretense of diplomacy, just a statement, a demand, and a vague, heavy threat. At the bottom, in black ink, was a single signature, Helen Grayson. Thomas stared at it for several seconds. At first he chuckled, a dry, confused laugh. It had to be a joke, a prank. No HOA had the right to claim someone's private property. Not legally, not rationally. But the laugh didn't last, because the more he read it, the less funny it became. The tone wasn't humorous. It was cold, businesslike, certain. He looked out the window. Across the street, someone closed their blinds. He pulled out the HOA handbook from the welcome packet he received on move-in day. 68 pages of bylaws, clauses, and vague language. He flipped through page after page. But nothing mentioned the HOA having any right to claim private tools or buildings not attached to the property. The shed? His tools? That was personal equipment, bought with his own money, used on his own land. It made no sense. Unless, of course, it didn't need to make sense. Not to them. The next morning, Thomas posted the letter online, anonymously. He hoped someone would confirm it was fake, illegal, a misunderstanding. But responses were mixed. Some people were shocked. Others weren't. That's Riverdale HOA for you. She did something similar to my uncle 2 years ago. Lawyer up now, don't wait. And one comment that stood out, simple and chilling. Whatever you do, don't ignore her. Thomas didn't sleep well that night. Not because of fear, but because of a new, deeper realization. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about trash bins, or mailboxes, or garden hoses. It was about power, and Helen Grayson had been practicing how to use it for years. Thomas didn't respond to the letter. Not officially, not at all. He didn't call Helen. He didn't show up to the next HOA meeting. He simply stayed home, tended his garden, and went about his days. Quietly, calmly, legally. But in Riverdale, silence wasn't neutral. It was defiance. And defiance had consequences. The first one came on a Tuesday morning. Thomas turned the kitchen faucet. Nothing. No water, not a drop. He called the utility company. They told him the stop order came from the HOA office, citing emergency maintenance. He hadn't been notified. There was no visible work happening anywhere nearby. He shrugged it off, assumed it would be fixed in a day, but the day turned into 2, then 3. On Friday evening, the lights flickered and cut out entirely. Not the whole block, just his house. He stepped outside, checked the breaker. Everything looked fine. He called the electric company again. Same answer. A hold had been placed on his account due to unresolved neighborhood compliance issues. When he asked for clarification, the representative apologized and said he would have to contact the HOA directly. That night, Thomas sat in his dark living room with Buddy curled beside him, trying to make sense of it all. And then the knocks began. In 5 days, 3 police visits. Always different officers. Always the same tone. We received a report. The first complaint that he had shouted at children walking past. The second, That loud music had been playing from his garage at 3 a.m. The third, that someone saw him pacing near the edge of his property, muttering things that sounded threatening. Each time the officers were polite but firm. Each time Thomas calmly denied the claims. There was never evidence. No one pressed charges. Still, the message was clear. Someone wanted to paint a picture, and they were using official channels to do it. By the second visit, Thomas noticed something else. The neighbors had changed. They no longer waved. Conversations at mailboxes stopped when he walked by. He caught one man, the same neighbor who had once offered to lend him a rake, pulling his children inside when Thomas stepped onto the sidewalk with Buddy. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was orchestrated isolation. Then came the final blow, the public one. At the next community meeting, Helen addressed the board and residents. She spoke of protecting neighborhood integrity, of ensuring emotional and physical safety. She never used his name. But on the screen behind her, under the heading Community Notices, was a single line in bold, Resident under review for ongoing behavioral concerns. Caution advised. And beside it, a blurred, zoomed-in photo of Thomas's shed taken from the street, framed like evidence. Thomas stood up from the back row, heart pounding. He moved toward the mic at the front of the hall. When he began to speak, there was no anger in his voice, only confusion, clarity. He started to explain, to ask questions, to challenge. But then, mid-sentence, the mic cut off. A pause. Helen, still seated, leaned slightly toward the board and said into her mic, "Thank you, Mr. Bates. This is not the time for personal grievances." No one objected. No one spoke. Thomas walked out of the room in silence, and for the first time it hit him. This wasn't just about a property dispute or policy misunderstanding. He wasn't just another homeowner anymore. He was a problem. He was the example. He was the one they wanted gone. The pressure eventually caught up to him. Thomas had tried to keep his job through the chaos, joining Zoom calls from his phone in the truck, responding to clients through spotty mobile internet, pretending everything was fine. But even the best masks crack under enough weight. He missed meetings, deadlines blurred. He made mistakes. Nothing major, but enough to be noticed. One morning, his manager called and suggested he take an indefinite leave to get things in order. It wasn't said unkindly, but the meaning was clear. By the end of the week, his email account was deactivated. With no income, the bills piled up fast. He still had his truck, and it ran, barely. At first, he just napped in it during the day to get away from the cold house. But over time, the truck became his real shelter. The house, once a dream, felt hostile, unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else. The water never came back on. The electricity flickered occasionally, but never stayed. The HOA gave no answers, no apologies, just more notices. Stuffed into the mailbox, taped to the door, wedged into the screen. Some were petty. Others felt targeted. One had a printed list of new compliance issues. Failure to maintain outdoor vegetation. Inappropriate vehicle positioning, unpermitted storage structures, referring to his tool shed. But one note stood out. Handwritten. Folded in half and slipped beneath his windshield wiper. A single sentence underlined 3 times. "You are not wanted here." There was no signature. Thomas didn't show it to anyone. There was no one to show it to. He tried calling friends from his old job, left messages. A few answered politely, but the conversations were short, awkward. The longer he stayed in Riverdale, the more it felt like he had disappeared, not just from the neighborhood, but from life itself. He began sleeping in the truck more often. Some nights he didn't even try to go inside. He would sit with the window cracked, a thin blanket over his shoulders, the same cup of coffee gone cold hours ago, still in the cup holder. He stopped counting days. The silence around him wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, like something waiting. The only sound that brought him back to the present was Buddy. His golden retriever never left his side. But even the dog had changed. No longer playful, he paced restlessly, whined softly at the door. Some nights he curled up in the passenger seat and pressed his nose against Thomas's arm. That soft whimper, just a breath, really, was the only sound Thomas could bear. The only reminder he hadn't lost absolutely everything. Because in the quiet, where no one called, no one checked, and no one stood with him, there was still one small, warm heartbeat beside his own. It happened at 3:17 a.m. Thomas would remember that time for the rest of his life. Not because of what he heard, but because of what he felt. A strange warmth in the air, a dry heat pressing through the cracked truck window. Then came the sound, faint at first, like dry leaves in wind, then louder, a deep, hungry crackle. He sat up, heart racing, confused. For a moment he thought it was a dream, but as he turned toward the house, his breath caught. Orange light flickered behind the curtains. Then he saw it, flames crawling up the side of his porch, like they were alive. He didn't think. He didn't grab his phone, his wallet, anything. He just opened the truck door and sprinted barefoot toward the house. The ground was cold, damp with dew, but the heat ahead burned like midday sun. The front window shattered just as he reached the steps. Inside, the smoke was thick, blinding. Buddy barked from the hallway, panicked and confused. Thomas didn't hesitate. He found him near the kitchen door, lifted him into his arms, and staggered backward through the smoke, stumbling out just before the porch collapsed behind them. He stood in the front yard, clutching Buddy, breathing hard, dressed in nothing but a thin t-shirt and boxers. His skin burned from the heat, but not from contact, from proximity. The fire moved fast, as if it had a purpose. The roof caved in before the fire trucks arrived. Flames licked the sky like signal flares. The neighbors gathered in silence, staying back, watching from safe distances. Expressions blank. No one offered a blanket. No one stepped forward. By 4 a.m., the home he built, protected, and suffered for was gone. Police arrived. They asked routine questions. Did you see anything? Do you know anyone who might want to hurt you? Thomas answered quietly. No. No, he didn't. But he did know what it felt like. One officer stepped aside, murmured something into a radio. Another took photos from a distance. No one said the word out loud at first, but by sunrise, it was official. Arson. No suspects, no witnesses. Thomas sat on the curb, a fire blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Buddy rested his head on Thomas's knee, still trembling. The fire was out, but the damage wasn't. Hours later, as the sun climbed above the smoke-blackened frame of what used to be his roof, Thomas walked over to the remnants of the mailbox. It stood at a tilt, half melted, surrounded by soot and ash. Inside, impossibly, was a single folded paper, untouched by fire, dry, clean, placed there after. He opened it slowly, his hands still shaking. 3 words, typed, no signature, no return address. You were warned. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just stood there, holding the letter, surrounded by the silent skeleton of everything he had ever owned. And in that silence, something changed. By the time the ashes had cooled, something inside Thomas had changed. It wasn't just grief. It wasn't even fear. It was something sharper, heavier, the quiet, focused kind of fury that comes when a person has nothing left to lose. For weeks, he had stayed silent. He let the letters pile up. He let his job go. He let the whispers pass. He hoped deep down that if he just endured it, the pressure would ease, that someone, anyone, would step in. But no one had, and now the house was gone. So Thomas stood up. He opened a drawer in what was left of the detached garage, the only structure untouched by fire, and pulled out a folder he hadn't touched in months. It was full, organized. Every letter, every fine, every screenshot and photo he had saved. HOA meeting agendas, printouts from the community forum, images of vandalized warnings, even the typed note from the mailbox, all of it. The next morning he drove to a small news station just outside of Richmond, WCVR Channel 7. He didn't make an appointment. He simply walked in, placed the folder on the front desk, and asked one thing: "Is there anyone here who still reports the truth?" It didn't take long for someone to listen. A junior field reporter named Emily Reyes agreed to hear him out. She expected something minor, a neighbor dispute, maybe a civil complaint. But as she flipped through the documents, her expression shifted, line by line, page by page. Her questions became sharper, her silence longer. By the end of their conversation, she said quietly, "If even half of this holds up, people need to know." 3 days later, the story aired. First, as a short evening segment, local HOA accused of harassment, unlawful power use. It showed a brief interview with Thomas, his voice steady but calm, standing beside the burned ruins of his home. Emily had done her homework. The report included references to other HOAs across the state accused of overreach. Then, something unexpected happened. The story spread, first locally, then regionally. Other stations picked it up, social media filled with comments, reposts, and messages, not just of sympathy, but of recognition. Other homeowners began reaching out, dozens, then hundreds. The same thing happened to me. "They fined me for planting the wrong flowers. Our HOA threatened to remove our fence because the slats were an inch too far apart." A quiet uprising was taking shape, one that started with fire and now burned with voices. Among those who noticed was a law firm in Richmond. A partner at Caldwell & Sons, specializing in civil rights and property law, sent Thomas a direct message through Emily's contact. "We saw your story. We'd like to help. No charge." It didn't feel real, but it was. With their support, Thomas filed a formal civil suit. But not just against Helen Grayson. The lawsuit named the entire HOA board. Every member who had approved the violations turned away complaints or stood by silently while the abuse grew. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting back at them. It was about setting a boundary, drawing a line, telling the world, and people like Helen, that silence does not equal surrender. And for the first time in months, Thomas didn't feel cornered. He felt steady. He felt ready. The courtroom was tense from the start. Thomas sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, backed by his legal team. Across the room, Helen Grayson looked composed, dressed in muted tones, her expression unreadable. Her defense painted her as a misunderstood community servant. But that narrative didn't hold for long. The evidence spoke louder: emails, HOA meeting transcripts, handwritten letters with her signature. One message read aloud shook the room. "If he refuses, we escalate. I want him out, permanently." Thomas watched, steady, as neighbors took the stand. Some admitted they were afraid to speak up. Others said they were pressured to file complaints. A pattern of abuse emerged. Not a misunderstanding, but a coordinated effort to force him out. Then came the moment no one expected. A man named Jeffrey Monroe, a former maintenance worker, took the stand. Nervous, shaking, but determined, he confessed that Helen had paid him, in cash, to sabotage Thomas's electrical system, and weeks later, to pour gasoline near the back porch. The room fell silent. Gasps echoed when a grainy doorbell video showed the cash exchange. The judge ordered a recess. When court resumed, Helen was no longer in her seat. She had been arrested on charges of conspiracy and attempted property sabotage. The HOA's operations were immediately suspended. A full audit was ordered. Riverdale, for the first time in years, was no longer under her control. And Thomas? He didn't celebrate. He simply exhaled, like a man who'd been holding his breath far too long. Justice came quietly. There was no applause in the courtroom, no dramatic headlines the next day. Just a final ruling delivered in firm, measured words. Thomas Bates had won. The court's decision was clear. The HOA's actions were not only unethical, they were unlawful. The board was dissolved. Helen Grayson was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, targeted harassment, and property-related offenses. She was sentenced to 6 years in a state facility. But more than that, the court ordered full financial restitution to Thomas, damages, legal fees, and a compensation package equivalent to the value of everything he had lost. It was the outcome many had hoped for, but for Thomas, it didn't feel like closure. Not yet. He returned to Riverdale one last time, stood in front of the vacant lot where his house had once stood. The grass had begun to grow again, covering the scars left behind by the fire. But the land no longer felt like home. Too much had happened there. Too many nights in silence. Too many warnings ignored. And so, he made a decision. He sold the property. Quietly. No press. No ceremony. People asked if he'd rebuild. Start over. But Thomas understood something deeper now. Rebuilding a house wasn't the same as rebuilding a life. He didn't need new walls. He needed a new purpose. And he found one. This year, using the compensation money, Thomas founded a nonprofit organization. He called it Burn No More. The mission was simple: protect homeowners from HOA abuse, provide legal support, educate residents about their rights, shine a light on the hidden power structures that too often go unchecked behind closed neighborhood gates. The first office was small, a rented room above a local library. But the impact was immediate. Calls started coming in, letters, emails. People from across the country shared their stories of intimidation, silence, and helplessness. For the first time, Thomas wasn't alone, and neither were they. Thomas Bates never wanted to become a voice for others. He never planned to speak on stages, answer letters from strangers, or be interviewed on local radio about housing reform. He was, at his core, just a man who wanted peace. A house. A quiet place to grow old with his dog and a garden. But life had other plans. Now, he travels from town to town, standing in school gyms, church basements, and city halls. Any place that will offer a microphone and a few folding chairs. He doesn't speak like a politician. His voice isn't polished. Sometimes it trembles. Sometimes he loses his place. But no one minds, because his words come from something real. They tried to burn me out of my home, he often says, but what they didn't know was fire can't destroy conviction. There's always a pause after that line, a stillness. People listen, not just politely, truly listen. Because many of them know exactly what he's talking about. They've lived their own, quieter versions of what Thomas endured. And when he finishes speaking, hands go up. Stories are shared. Tears are held back. Sometimes not. Some call it a movement. He doesn't. For Thomas, it's just the truth being told. One room at a time. Through his nonprofit, Burn No More, he's helped pass 2 state-level transparency laws requiring HOAs to disclose all disciplinary actions and decisions. He's connected families with pro bono legal help. He's helped stop 3 separate neighborhood associations from pushing out low-income homeowners through intimidation. But even with the victories, he rarely talks about justice. He talks about resilience. And every night, when the meetings end and the lights go out, Thomas walks Buddy through whatever neighborhood he's in, no matter how unfamiliar. They walk under the stars, not hurried, not searching. He doesn't live in Riverdale anymore, and he never rebuilt the house that stood there. But in many ways, he built something larger, a network, a message, a reminder that you can lose a job, a roof, a reputation, even your silence. But if you still have your voice, you are not defeated. And Thomas Bates? He didn't burn. He rose.